Well, good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be joined today by the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed. Welcome. And she is here to brief you on the Financing for Sustainable Development report, which was launched today. The report has inputs from 60 organizations, and it shows the deep and widespread negative economic and social consequences of the pandemic in both developed and developing countries. Before we start, just a reminder to mute your microphones for those who are joining us virtually. And we will start with some opening remarks, and then we'll take a few questions. So please, DSG, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you, colleagues from the press. Thank you for joining us at this important launch. I also have with me Naveed Hanif, who has been at the helm of affairs of getting this report off the press. Presenting the 2021 Financing for Sustainable Development report. It is produced by DESA in collaboration with more than 60 of our international agencies, including the international financial institutions, and that in itself is unique. And so we have a broad, a breadth of opinions that have shaped the outcomes of this report. The message of the report is clear and it's stark. COVID-19 is the leading sharply bifurcated world, leaving hundreds of millions of people behind, and putting the development agenda seriously at risk without immediate action on financing for development. The pandemic has caused the worst recession in 90 years and disproportionately affected the most vulnerable segments of our societies, including women and youth. We're seeing between 119 and 124 million people estimated to be the newly pushed into extreme poverty, and the world has lost the equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs. An unprecedented 16 trillion in stimulus and recovery funds have sought to mitigate the worst effects of this global disaster, but less than 20% of that has gone to developing countries. We see the same imbalance in the vaccine rollout. 60% of the COVID vaccine supply was reserved by a handful of wealthy countries, leaving the vast majority of the world years behind. Some developing countries may not receive the vaccine until 2024. Despite partial debt relief through commendable initiatives by the IFIs and the G20, 6 countries are now in default, while 42 have had their credit rating downgraded, making a global debt crisis increasingly likely. What this pandemic has proved beyond all doubt is that we ignore global interdependence at our peril. Disasters don't respect national boundaries, as we've seen with climate change, and a diverging world is a catastrophe for all of us. It's both morally right and in everyone's economic interest, self-interest, to help developing countries to overcome this crisis, and I would say the most vulnerable of them. If we don't drastically increase financing for development, we will prolong the pandemic by years and face another lost decade for development. To change trajectory, we need to change the rules of the game. Relying on the pre-crisis rules will lead to the same pitfalls that have been revealed over the past year. Today's new report puts forward important recommendations. It calls on governments to invest in people, social protection, sustainable infrastructure, and green jobs. It also calls on the international community to support the poorest and most vulnerable countries with debt relief and other measures to ensure liquidity, including the allocation of additional special drawing rights. The report also calls for the reform of tax, trade, and debt systems and architecture so that they're aligned with the 2030 Agenda and sustainable development. We must never allow a health crisis to transform into an economic, social, and humanitarian disaster. We are already feeling the impacts of the socioeconomic impact. The United Nations is strongly committed to helping ensure that all our countries can emerge on equal footing from this crisis and with an equal chance of building a safer, healthier, more equal and sustainable future. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go to questions. Edie, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Secretary General. It's always a delight to see you here. Come back on more often, and welcome from the United Nations Correspondents Association. My question is, how do you realistically expect countries in the developed world that have all been reeling themselves from the pandemic to actually come up with all of this additional money to help developing countries and to avoid massive debt defaults.
Thank you, Edie. It's great to see you too. I like the word you put there, realistically. I think the realistically is about the implications if they don't do it. This world is interconnected. Economies and trade and what happens in the world is so interconnected. Businesses and the economies will not open fully even in the developed world if the developing world itself is closed. I think we've often said that where there is a virus, COVID, anywhere, then it is everywhere. It goes the same for what we are seeing with the economic crisis. It will have a backlash on other economies. And this is where we feel that the resources in the world to try to address some of these fiscal gaps and liquidity challenges that developing countries have is really marginal to what has already been spent in developed countries to try to stabilize their economies and keep people in work and safe. So it is the impact of seeing many of our development gains going back a year, 2 years, 10 years, the decade being out of sight for the SDGs. That is very real in the lives of women. That's very real in the lives of young people who are losing their jobs that would have no hope, and the anxiety that causes, and eventually the instability of different crises in the world are happening as well. The resources that are needed to tackle climate change, which in itself has repercussions for a more stable and peaceful world. So I think it is in one's vested interest that the resources that are available, we need to find ways to ensure that other economies have access to them, that we do avoid the debt crisis. We need to make sure that sovereign debt is addressed. We believe that private debt will become a challenge if we have no foundations at all within the debt architecture that we have today.
Okay, James, please.
James Bayes, Al Jazeera. What does this all then mean for the SDGs? Is there any hope of reaching those targets, or should you abandon them and start again? And if I may, because we have you here, and we don't have you here that often, your boss is running for a second term as Secretary General. Can you tell us about his record on gender equality and how, as the most senior woman in the UN system, you feel about the fact that he's likely to get reelected? That means there's going to have been a man at the head of the UN for over 80 years.
80 years, yeah, long time. Let me start with the first question. We never give up on achieving the goals until we get to 2030, and then we have another 15 years of what we need to attempt to do to keep people out of poverty, to reduce the suffering, to have a more equal world. So I would say that the SDGs are challenged. They are off track. The COVID, pandemic has created an enormous challenge to that. But I also think it's an opportunity. It's one that we actually have never been more capable of, had the tools or the resources or the connectivity as a human family to do something about it. We also have the largest cohort of young people in the world. That in itself is an asset, and we need to invest in that. But we need to do it equally. We need everyone to be at the table and have an equal chance of trying to get the SDGs done. We see in many countries, if liquidity and we could address supporting better the stimulus packages in developing countries, that we could then begin to change the investment trajectory into the green transitions, more connectivity, a different energy mix. With the connectivity, we then see a chance for more people to get into education, looking at health and prevention in the future, jobs going online. I mean, there are many things that we can benefit from if we can just begin the response to get a good recovery, but one that is different, one that helps us put the SDGs back on track. So I'm optimistic that we can do this. It's a huge lift. That's what the UN is about. Day in, day out, we tackle the reality and trying to get to the aspiration. And we have a number of big conferences this year where leaders will come. It starts with one on Monday on financing for development, and it will go through the next few months all the way to the end of the year with COP26. So opportunities abound. It's about whether we have the political will to come together to actually capture them and not allow the window to close on future generations. With respect to Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, 80 years is a long time. And his offer to be re-elected, I think, is right. He is our feminist in chief. I think we've achieved an enormous amount on his watch, in spite of the difficulties that we had, starting from where he can do something about it, to where he makes a call, to where he convenes to try to keep the world together on gender equality and issues around women's leadership. In the UN, certainly on his watch, sometimes I like to take credit for it all myself, but being a woman and together with the chef de cabinet, but it is our feminist in chief, the Secretary General, that opens up the opportunities for more women in leadership. We've seen that in the senior management. We've seen it geographically. Many more women of color are heading up agencies and important departments in the United Nations. We still have a lot to do and a long way to go. And so I look forward to us really paving the way to a Secretary General that would be a woman in the future.
Great. We'll do Majid and then Toby.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary General. I'm here in the back. Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is about the Sustainable Development Goals. Do you think, because of the big impacts of the pandemic, the timeline to achieve the goals should be changed, and the goals itself, the ambitions in itself, should be modified? And my second question is, as the most senior woman at the United Nations, there is this crisis which is related to the thousands of ISIS victims. Those have been victims of ISIS war, use sex against them, and all this. They are still in the camps, thousands of them. There are reports coming out of their dire situation, and they are waiting for justice. As you know, we have UNITAT in Iraq. And that process is very slow, understandably. What do you think? Do you think the United Nations should do more with regard to the situation of the ISIS women victims? And do you think there should be a more rigorous international focus on their situation, in particular, in the refugee camps? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You would have seen that policy briefs and calls to action for peace in the home and for addressing gender-based violence, particularly in humanitarian settings, is something that the SG is very committed to. We have to do more. We have to do more as a system on the ground where our footprint is, in convening with governments, with stakeholders, to try to make sure that we can end the atrocities and the scourge and begin the healing, because many of these women are survivors. And that survival needs to be supported going forward. So there is a lot that the UN system itself can do, and to begin to program for that sooner rather than later. All of this needs political will, and it needs resources. And it's important for the world to come together, for our member states to come together. With the number of crises all over the world, you're almost competing demands, but everyone needs special attention. So I would say that we continue to use our voice where we can with member states to put greater focus on the needs of women who are living this hour by hour. This is not a question of let's do this in 6 months' time when we have time. We have to do it now. But I would also say that the resources for the humanitarian response that we have, we need to increase those resources and ensure that they're there in the bridge to peace, that when they come out of these situations, that there is a future that we pay attention to, and that they become very much an integral part of the society thereafter to begin the healing process. For many will take generations. This is not a quick fix. On the SDGs, look, the timelines and the goals, we should redouble our efforts. I think we were slow off the starting block to begin with. The first 5 years, understanding the paradigm shift and how we needed to be more fit for purpose as a system. Countries themselves, remember we had been responding to development in the MDGs through just one lens of social development, and even that not rooted in the economies and the spends that we have domestically and otherwise. So we need to see an increase in ODA, living up to those commitments, leveraging financial flows, and looking at differently at the way in which we integrate the investments so that we're maximizing the impact and the multiplier effects that we could have with investments. For instance, we would be able to leapfrog if the connectivity and education was a window that we went through into communities. We would see power in communities that we had not had. We would see access to resources where people can be paid online for the jobs that they do at a local level. We would see health sectors and the health systems working more effectively. So to look at the multiplier effects and the integration of investments that could happen on the SDGs to perhaps get to some of those timelines and the goals sooner. Every year we will have a moment in the United Nations which will look at the gaps and try to fill those gaps so that we accelerate the impact on the SDGs. As I said earlier, I'm not planning to fail before I've got to the 2030 goal. I'm planning to get there, and when I get there, we'll take stock, and then we'll know what we have left to do, and there'll probably be more challenges or different responses that are needed by 2030.
Okay, Toby, and then we'll take a question from the virtual room.
Hi, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you very much for your briefing. Toby Burns with NHK. One follow-up on the SDGs, which is that in a financing context, which of the SDGs would you say are most vulnerable and have the most potential to be set back? And my second question is on monetary issues. The world facing a potential debt crisis, and with so much stimulus now distributed inequitably in many ways, can you assess the response of monetary authorities? Should we be worried about inflation, interest rates? What more can central banks in the developed world be doing? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the SDGs, I think from a personal point of view and from evidence, I would say that the goal, although all of them are at risk, the goal most at risk is the one on inequalities. This touches in every aspect, the social, the economic, and the environmental aspects of the SDGs, and that's the one I would really focus on, because this world needs to get connected behind a more equal world, whether it is finance and it's just equal distribution, or it is gender equality, or we're really looking to see in the green transitions whether that in itself will impact the lives of the very poor and the vulnerable, most of which have had nothing to do with the footprint that has caused a lot of climate action. So inequalities is where I would lay perhaps the greatest risk in all of the goals. As we go to the international community, you would have seen from the SG's call, but also from the call in this report, that there's a lot more that can be done in terms of first looking at the SDRs and an additional distribution of SDRs. This will help to alleviate a lot of the fiscal challenges that many developing countries are receiving, but an acknowledgement that vulnerability today is beyond low-income countries to middle-income countries, where there are large swaths of inequality and populations, young people in particular, to middle-income countries that have been so vulnerable to climate change. And yet don't have access to many of the resources that are available now for low-income countries. So a broadening of that space, and a broadening, of course, or a lengthening of the DSSI, that is also an opportunity to free up more liquidity in countries to do more in the stimulus packages, and I hope tying them to these transitions that need to happen now, the opportunity of catching up with what we've lost on the SDGs so far.
Okay, now we are going to take a question from Iftikhar, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary General. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Secretary General. Salam. My question has been partially asked by Toby, but I would again put it to you, because I haven't read the full report and seen just your summary that you presented. Does the report contain specific proposals, recommendations to address debt crisis and the liquidity problem?
Yes, it does. There are a number of immediate actions that we can take, and the first and foremost is access to COVID-19 and the vaccines because of the socioeconomic impact it's had. And as we had said, where there is COVID, then it's there everywhere, and it does affect economies, it does affect people, and it's certainly the investments that we need to make in climate action. But we've also said that ODA commitments must be met. We have asked for additional SDRs to be distributed. We've again said debt relief we should be focusing that on the most vulnerable countries, and that's important now, the urgency of it, and the gaps that need to be filled. There are longer-term recommendations that we have made on human capital investments. Again, this is all around the framing of the SDGs. This is what the Addis Ababa Agreement was all about, moving from billions to trillions so that we can make those investments to meet the targets that have been set.
Okay, thank you. And now we will go to Desi from CCTV.
Hi, Ms. Deputy Secretary General. Can you hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
You can hear me, right? Okay, cool. Okay, so in the past few months or weeks, we heard Secretary General and many officials from the United Nations said that we can use the pandemic to build back better, right? But however, they also mentioned that in climate change, in poverty, and many other aspects, we're actually facing a deteriorating situation. In what way can we really build back better? And one more question would be, what can countries like China or other countries do to contribute to this process to build back better? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think first let's continue to say that the North Star is still the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Agreement. Those are important tools that we have, and we need to focus on how we use those as roadmaps to accompany countries and to support them with the policy actions that they need to take. But it's also a conversation that needs to happen between those that have and those that don't. A more equitable access to resources, and when you have those resources, the cost of those resources needs to be considered as well. So a lot of credit that goes out there to developed countries at minus or 1%. We are seeing bonds that are going out to developing countries at 8 or 9%. That in itself is inequitable. So we need to address some of these structural issues, and some of the conversations, hopefully at the spring meetings, will take cognizance of this, as will as it should do in the G7 and the G20 meetings. These recommendations in this report are incredibly important to inform those discussions where member states come round the table to determine how they are going to better, I think, show the commitment to multilateralism that is needed in a world that is so connected. What can countries like China do? I think in the context of supporting countries to achieve the SDGs, they also have a role to play in the financing of South-South cooperation, but also at the tables where these decisions are taken in the G20 to move resources towards those countries that are more vulnerable and need them right now. But they also can support the climate action, the Paris Agreement. And I think that this is important with the energy transitions. You know that the SGs call for an end to coal and for those energy transitions to become real sooner rather than later. And so we expect leadership for China on the climate agenda as well.
Okay, Carla, please, and I think we'll wrap up after that. Carla, your mic, please. Thank you.
Well, it's great to see you back here and to know that the SDGs are in good hands, difficult though the situation is. I have two questions. One, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. Did you say 60% or 16% of the control of the vaccine is being held by the developed countries and a very small? What was the figure that you gave?
60%.
That's really astronomical.
Well, yes, I think, for us, the whole issue around the vaccines, this started really well. The WHO and colleagues from the EU and from the pharmaceutical industries and others, as we designed the ACT Accelerator last year and as we launched the COVAX facility, there was a lot of hope. But that slowly has fizzled away, and what we are seeing right now is really there's next to no vaccines available, particularly for frontline workers in developing countries. I hope that we can try to address that in terms of production and distribution as soon as possible. It is quite a moral blight on global leadership that this is not happening across the world as it should.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question. Edie had mentioned the need for funds to increase the amount of, I believe, and availability of vaccines. And this is a question I think you know I've asked for many years. The funds exist. Trillions of dollars are being spent into the military, into upgrading nuclear weapons. The political will does not exist to transfer those funds, most of which are really useless because we couldn't possibly afford a war, and transfer those funds to increasing the amount of vaccine that's available globally and to the poorest countries, because I believe it was the Secretary General or somebody very much involved in this who mentioned the fact that if the vaccine is not given to the poorest areas, there will be mutant strains that will develop, and that escalates the problem beyond what it already is. So what force can you use to change investment priorities to face this? It's like Nero fiddling while Rome is burning, it seems.
Well, we'll continue to use the convening that we have amongst member states, the moral suasion that we have. We continue to increase the amounts of money that is needed for the production and purchase and distribution of vaccines through our international financed institutions. We hope that a lot of the recommendations, if not all the recommendations of this report, will inform the discussions that happen in the spring meetings, that happen in the Financing for Development Forum of ECOSOC, in the G7 and the G20. Continue to push to make the case that it is better to spend now and get everyone vaccinated than to pay ever so much more in lives, in resources, in development. So, you know, we really have to avoid that we have a decade of lost development.
Okay, if those are all the, I think there's, yes, Abdelhamid, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry I came late. Madam Deputy Secretary General, I am asking about the situation in Gaza. The UN COVAX sent only 60,000 vaccine to the Palestinian people. Israel is denying the Palestinians the vaccine that it is selling to other countries and donating to 4 countries who accepted to have Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Is Israel in violation of international law or not?
I think what we are seeing right now is that vaccines as a whole are not going to those who need it most in developing countries, Gaza included. And that's where the SG and the leadership here is pushing to make sure that there is equitable and just distribution of these vaccines to everyone. This is a big challenge, I think, for leaders to acknowledge that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that is getting the vaccines to those who need it most.
Okay,
My
thank you,
question
everyone.
is about Israel. I ask you specifically if Israel, in violation of its obligations as an occupying power.
Said, I think that what we really need to contend with is that we get vaccines to everyone. And we need to do that through the means that we have available, and every country has got responsibilities to do that within their domains.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General. And Farhan will be with you in just a few minutes.